All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. We are picking up in Mesillas Hashem today. New parak, Parak Yudal, chapter 14 in Mesillas Yesharim. So the Ramchal writes as follows. He says, Chelki aprishos harashim shlosha. There are three primary parts. Remember again, in the title of this chapter is Bechelki aprishos, the different aspects or different components of prishos. So the Ramchal writes, there are three aspects or three parts to prishos. Kihine yesh prishos bahanaos, prishos bedinim, prishos b'minhagim. There's a prisha from pleasure, right? A separation of oneself from certain pleasures. A prisha, a separation bedinim. We'll see what that means in halacha, specifically again the observance of chumras, stringencies, and prisha b'minhagim. And we'll see again, prisha minhagim. Now, minhagim we're going to see over here could mean really from certain social interactions, certain modes of conduct. So let's analyze each of them. Ha-prishos ba'nos, u'mashiz karnu b'parakat hodem, t'hainu shlalakachas medivrei ha'olam, elamasha tzorech yachriach. So the concept of prishos ba'nos, right, separating oneself from certain pleasures, that's what we discussed in the last chapter. So that's the approach to life that says, I'm only going to take that which I need from this world in order to be able to function. Right? Only what I need. Now, again, we pointed out in yesterday's shiur, the word need, right, is a very open-ended, sometimes ambiguous statement. But again, that's for each of us to decide. And again, this applies to all forms of pleasure. It applies to food. It applies to intimacy. It applies to clothing. It applies to trips. Shmuos, interestingly enough, he says, could even apply to music. Anything like this, any form of pleasure. Now, of course, there are days in which, again, physical pleasure is a mitzvah. So there's a mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos, there's a mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tiv. So on those days, perhaps, again, one is supposed to enjoy a bit more. But again, the first level of prishos, what we call prishos bahanaos, means a person makes a conscious decision that I'm only going to take or enjoy from this world what I quote unquote need. And I'm trying to put a distance, separate myself from excess pleasure, as I recognize that could ultimately lead me down a road I don't want to go. That's the first level. Prishos bedinim. What does it mean, a prishos in halacha? He says, hula hachmir b'am tamid. This means sometimes he machmir in halacha. There's sometimes, again, I recognize that I myself, I need to be machmir. I need to be stringent in observance, or I should say, in Jewish law. Dahainu, he says, lachush afilu divrei yacham machlokes and tamonira, and this means that sometimes I have to pay heed even to a solitary opinion in halacha. Afilu shein halacha kimoso ubetnai shelo yechumro kulo. So we'll say this second level of prishos, what he calls prishos bedinim, is the recognition that sometimes I need to be machmir for myself in a particular area of halacha. Right? I will say an interesting idea that sometimes the halacha says A, but I know for myself I need to be a little bit more stringent. Right, so it's interesting. The Navi Yecheskel said, my soul never became defiled. My soul never became tamei. What does that mean? It's actually interesting. The Gemara Darshans, Shlachalti mi behema shahora bo chacham. Yecheskel said, I never ate from meat that I needed to ask a shaila on. So I will say, for us it's different. We buy already packaged kosher meat, right? But again, you hear stories. A person would have an animal shechted. They would have a question about the kashrus of the animal. They would bring the animal. They bring the chicken, right, to the Rav, to the Talmud Chacham, to go and pass on the chicken. So Yecheskel said, I never ate meat that you had to ask a shaila on. I never ate that. And again, are you allowed to eat meat that you have to ask a shaila on? Of course, as long as the answer is what? Yeah. That it's kosher, right? Then it's fine. Yecheskel was saying, for me, I established my own additional chumrah, that if there was a shaila, I didn't partake of it. V'lo achalti mibisar kuskus. I never ate meat that was kuskus. What's kuskus? I'll say, so kuskus is an expression that means shechted quickly. Shecht. I will say, if you have an animal that's very sickly, So remember again, if you shecht the animal while it's still alive, the meat is fit for consumption. If you wait until it dies, of course, again, now it's in a vela, the meat is not fit for consumption. So sometimes there would be an animal, you say, kus, quickly, go ahead, shecht it quickly. So again, Yechezkel said, I never ate from such an animal. What is Yechezkel saying? I took upon myself an additional level of chumrah. Right? This was the additional level of stringency that I established for myself, not to go ahead and partake of these things. V'hinei, kol ze muter hu min adin vadai. All of these things are muter, elihu da'achmir anafshe. Yechezkel was machmir on himself. Ukvar zacharti l'mala, she'im l'mol mimashu huter al kol yisrael l'prushim, she'eshel nacharchik min akira min adomelo umin adomelo. So again, Rabbi say, remember, we have recognized that in halacha, ultimately again, there are certain people who maintain just what we'll call the standard level of observance. They live up to expectations, like the tzaddikim. But then, of course, there's the chassidim, and the chassid chooses to surpass expectations. The chassid holds himself to a higher level, and the chassid may again hold himself to this higher level of chumrah as well. V'chein amar mar ukva. It's very interesting, incredible Gemara Maseches Chulin. So Mar Ukva said, I am like vinegar compared to wine when it comes to my father. So Mar Ukva was saying, my father conducted himself like wine, right, a higher level. I conduct myself like vinegar in this particular area. What particular area? When my father ate meat, he would wait 24 hours to eat cheese. Literally, again, Mar Ukva said his father would go ahead and wait 24 hours between fleishiks and milchiks. Me, I won't eat meat and milk in the same meal together. But again, in a different meal, I will. So again, Mar Ukva, and I will say, but there's a lot of machlok is exactly what Mar Ukva meant by that. Is it literally just the same meal? Or perhaps again, it's the amount of time between meals. This is where the whole machlok is probably between 3 hours and 6 hours and 1 hour. And again, that's the schema. The point over here is that Mar Ukva was saying, my father held himself to such a high standard, literally 24 hours between meat and milk. And me, I don't hold myself to that same standard. He was like, he was the wine standard, I'm the vinegar standard. Now, both say, ubevandai, shem psak halacha, kemo shahaya osa avivosa. Obviously, the halacha doesn't follow Mar Ukva's father. See, I will say, no one in halacha says you have to wait 24 hours between meat and milk. No one makes that statement. But rather again, but what happened? Shimkein lo haya Mar Ukva osa negezeh. Because if that was the halacha, then what? Of course, Mar Ukva would have observed in that fashion as well. Elo sha'aviv machmir haya b'frishuso ulekach haya Mar Ukva kore asmu chala bar chamra. But rather again, we'll say, what is this an example of? It's a chumrah. Mar Ukva's father was machmir with himself, and therefore halacha l'maisa would not eat meat would not eat milk, would not eat cheese for 24 hours after consuming meat. And therefore Mar Ukva called himself Chala bar Chamra, right? Vinegar, the son of wine. Why did he call him that? Because again, he wasn't as machmir as his father. So therefore I will say, we stop over here for today, so that Ramchal has outlined for us the first two of the 3 levels of Prisha. So remember again, level 1 is what we call Prisha Bahana, which is the typical form of Prishas that we discussed in yesterday's shiur, which is separating oneself from what we'll call excess pleasure. What's the definition of excess pleasure? There is no definition of excess pleasure. It's a personalistic, right? It's a subjective definition. I have to decide for myself what I quote unquote need, right? Utilize that, enjoy that, and try to separate myself from the excess. That's level 1. Level 2 is Prisha B'dinim, which means Chumros. And I will say this is an interesting idea because, sometimes what ends up happening is, the challenge is when there are so many Chumros and Chumros become identified as Halacha, that's a challenge, right? That's a challenge. So sometimes kind of like we swing the pendulum in the other way, right? Everything is such a Chumrah, so I'm not going to observe any Chumros. That's not good either, because the truth is we all need chumros, right? There are areas in which maybe I struggle with halachically or struggle with observance-wise. In those areas, it's good to have a chumrah, because their chumrah, certain stringency, safeguards my basic ritual observance and obligation. So that's what we call, again, Prishos B'dinim. Tomorrow Shem Eretz Hashem will cover the last category, Prishos B'minhagim. Shkoyach.